Welcome everyone to our episode 23 in the year 2022. 2022. And I'm really honoured to have our guest, who I'll interview today and chat with and have a conversation. But first, I'd like to acknowledge our traditional custodians of the land that we are all speaking on today. And in particular, where I'm from, up in around southeast Queensland, is the Yagara and the Durable people of the land. And I respect and acknowledge all our traditional custodians here on this land, and elders that have come from far and wide across the globe that now reside here and that we listen and learn and get all our wisdom from. I acknowledge all the Australian Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders of this land. And welcome to our special guest, Bobby Alu, or should I say Charles Aka Bobby Alu. Bobby, welcome to Walking Through Worlds, and I'd love for you to sort of tell people a bit about what you've done. I mean, I can sort of give that real quick overview. You know, Bobby is obviously an accomplished professional artist, musician, songwriter. He's toured over 14 countries, done hundreds and hundreds of shows, probably into the thousands. I love that he says he's a mix and inspired by his great people, Bill Withers, Bob Marley, Ben Harper, and of course Fat Freddy's Drop. And I love that. There's the three B's: Bill, Bob, Ben, and Billy. And Bobby, not Billy. So, welcome.
Thank you. What an intro. Appreciate it. While I'm here, I'm coming at you from, I live in Byron Bay, so I will do an acknowledgement to the Bundjalung Nation, the Arakwal people. And yeah, it's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for interviewing or questioning.
Yeah, no, I'm fascinated to explore with you, a young Gold Coast boy. Now, you were born in this country? You were born here?
Yes.
So, with a mother who has Samoan roots, so you've had a cultural heritage, of which growing up on the Gold Coast, I suppose doing your primary school, doing secondary school, how did you find, I mean, when did a sort of light turn on that you always had this sort of different cultural background, and how did you navigate that in terms of, okay, but I'm an Australian, I'm born here?
Yeah, it's a fantastic, big question to start with, and you know, that has been a big story for me my whole life, and you know, I'm at the point where I embrace it and I love every bit of it, but it's been a steady, interesting journey. You know, my mother was one of the first Samoans to come from her village to Australia, to Brisbane, in the early 80s. And, you know, as I'm growing older, I'm sort of getting a bit more of a picture of her story and her life as I'm passing her ages. And I think back, every birthday I think back, I'm like, wow, what was Mum like in this time? And so, you know, for me personally, I guess I always knew that there was something a little different, and I was always felt between many worlds. You know, I identified with all my cultures, and yet it was a balancing act.
So what were your different cultures? Like your dad, what was he?
Yeah. So Dad grew up in a regional town in Australia, in New South Wales, called Narrandera. And he's a descendant from, you know, from England, basically two settlers that came to Australia, two brothers, the Wall brothers, that they came to Australia for a new life, a fresh life. And, you know, my father, he grew up in this regional town, and he just had this adventurous outlook on life, and he basically wanted to move to the coast, and he did, and he got into scuba diving, and that basically took him on big trip around the South Pacific. And then he ended up in Samoa and fell in love with the culture, the people, the diving, the place was magical for him. And yeah, I guess the rest is history, really.
Yeah, and is it you, or you have a brother or sister in your
I have
family?
a younger brother. Yeah, there's two of us, which is quite rare for Samoans. Usually it's quite a big family. My mum's one of 10. And, you know, very, very strong culture. And I think that's something that, you know, I grew up with, that I was pretty unaware that it was happening. And one thing that I do, you know, notice in my mother is, you know, she moved to Australia, and basically big countries for small South Pacific nations, you know, they seem so magical and far away. And, you know, lots of mum's family were very supportive of mum moving to Australia for a better life, you know, in their eyes and in their minds. So my mother coming to Australia, like, she basically wanted the best life possible for my brother and I. And that was living in Australia, growing up in the Australian culture. And so, you know, I think it was interesting for my brother and I, because we had this, you know, amongst our primary school friends, you know, we were the only people that were a bit different, you know, because Gold Coast was being, you know, was starting to get a lot more immigrants, but it was still slow.
Blonde hair and blue eyes and very white. Or
Yeah,
suntan.
totally. Yeah, exactly.
The surfing culture, you know.
Yeah, that's totally it.
Wow, and growing up on the Gold Coast, which part, was North End or the South End?
We were in the North End.
Yep.
Yeah, so
Beautiful.
It was not, you know, I'm very grateful for my upbringing. I went to a great school. I had really beautiful friends, and although, you know, there was times that it was tough, you know, kids can be harsh and mean, but you know, all in all, it was beautiful, and mum's connection with her family was still so strong that there was always uncles visiting. In fact, some moved to Brisbane to be closer together. And, you know, my grandparents lived with us for years from Samoa. And so there was always this thread that existed through the upbringing. And, you know, when I was a teenager, sure, it was difficult. But these days I look at it and I feel so lucky and enhanced to have these, you know, all these different threads to look at and all these different perspectives to sit with. And, you know, it's quite often now that I feel so, you know, lucky to live in Australia, yet I've got this Samoan perspective on so many different things, and blending them together as I am blended, you could say, has just been a real advantage, I find, and I feel very lucky.
What was the village in Samoa? What is it called?
She's from Satalo village in Whalealili, and you know, there's actually a famous old Samoan song, Whalealili. It's a very it's a beautiful life, and you know, there's been times where the first time I went to Samoa, as like, you know, that I can properly remember as a teenager, I felt pretty lost because I wasn't, you know, I had no idea what they were saying. I just, you know, there was so many things that I connected with, but I felt so distant. And so that definitely was a journey to find my way of connecting. And it was through music that really I felt connected and proud. And I do remember a distinct moment where I don't know what happened. I just dropped everything. I just said, I am who I am. I've got all this goodness that I can either resent or I can embrace. And I took the embrace. Yeah.
I just got goosebumps then. I mean, the power of music, and then you discovering that back in your sort of mum's homeland, and then making that connection through music. And it would have been complex, wouldn't it? Like not knowing the language or knowing the ceremonies, knowing the rituals that Samoan people have, you know, because there is a lot of, as I've learned, you know, along with my good friend Ty, you know, our other co-host, Tai Tungo, he's told me about the different elements of chiefdom, you know, within the villages, you know, of which he's now talking high chief, and each village has their group of Mai Tai. Were you aware of that sort of custom early on, or was that an evolving?
Yeah, oh, definitely. But it's fragmented because, you know, obviously I grew up in Australia, had different life. And you know, I think there was a point where I was, you know, I showed a little bit of disappointment towards my mother for not being so, like, you know, clear with all these Samoan customs. And you know, that was just me rebelling because I know now that she basically did the best that she could, and in bringing me and my brother a different and a better life. But the thing is, it's so complicated, you know, like if you're looking from the outside, there's so many, it's, although that, you know, you could look at Polynesian life as being quite simple, there's lots of, intuitive, you know, actions and things that can happen, that are really so intertwined in the culture, and you really have to live it to know it and to be it. So, yeah, you know, I still find out more things, and I have great interest, and every visit, every conversation I have with aunties and uncles, I'm learning something new, which is, you know, I find rich and amazing.
So when you travel overseas and, you know, you meet different people, you know, through your concerts and tours, I mean, you obviously have an Australian passport. I mean, do you have dual citizenship with Samoa, or that's not a thing?
No, it's yeah.
You can only get that if you're a New Zealander.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, or Swiss.
Yeah, true.
Or if from Israel.
Yeah, true.
All of those different choices, but not Samoa.
Yeah.
When you were sort of growing up, how did you find, I mean, when you found someone else from a Polynesian background, or even when did you start unpacking First Nation stories, you know, our own First Peoples? When did that sort of become aware in your sort of consciousness?
Yeah, quite early on. So I think it all sort of happened when I was wrestling with, you know, with me, which seems to happen a lot. And, you know, with this human existence, it's always me. But I think, you know, there is also a penny drop moment when you start thinking of a collective and thinking of us and we. And one thing that has happened as I've been traveling around the world doing lots of shows and sharing my story and of this, you know, I usually sort of relate it to being on like a bridge, you know, to two worlds. And, you know, you can be confused by the bridge, or you could just be empowered by it. Like, you can access these bridges. You've like, it's a bridge. You've got access to both worlds. And, you know, there's so many people like me in being half Polynesian, but not necessarily just Polynesian, but lots of different cultures around the world that have started coming to my shows. And, you know, it's definitely a really interesting time because lots of that, you know, mixture of cultures was happening in 70s, 80s, I guess, in Australia. So now there's lots of, you know, there's just so much around, of all colours, and I think sharing that, you start to look out for it. You start to look out for these cultural exchanges, and you know, relating back to that being a bridge in two worlds. It's the same with being on this land that we live in, Australia, and the Indigenous people here. You know, it's like we're on a bridge here, and instead of them being separate, it's like they can be together.
I think
easier
that's
said than
important,
done,
isn't it?
But you know, I think having experienced this sort of means that we look out for it more. Yeah, which is, and I've been lucky to go to all sorts of different countries. I travelled with this band from Australia called Ochre, with the, Indigenous Torres Strait man, Stu Fergie, playing Yidaki. And, it's amazing the connection that we shared while in Canada with some of the First Nations people there. And that was a real interesting talking to them and listening to their stories. And obviously it's very similar to what's happening here.
It's interesting, those bonds between the Canadian First Peoples and Australian First Peoples and Samoan and Polynesian. Like, there's a deep connection there, isn't there?
100%.
The way the families are raised, the social challenges that they are, still facing as the broader Polynesian youth population is, about losing their connection to who they are, their meaning, their identity, their belonging. Growing up as a young person, if they hadn't found that thing that grounded them, like you found music as a centre point. Brother Ty and I always talk about the youth justice system. In the prisons, there's over 50% of First Nations, but the other 50% are Polynesians, disengaged. And part of it is because they've come away from their country, or they've been born here, or they've come here at a young age, and they lose that rites of passage, of manhood, going through 10, 11, 12, 13, through that sort of puberty period, which we know in First Nations now, that kippering and, the sort of initiations that took place was a very important step to ground them and cement them for the future. I mean, thankfully, you probably look back that music thing. How old were you when that sort of penny dropped? Around that age, was it?
Yeah, it was a teenage. Yeah, it was. It was probably my late teens. Like, it was always there, but I think, it's interesting. Like, the word that we use a lot is the connection. And that is something that's really common that I've noticed on lots of First Nations people and small countries like in the South Pacific, is lots of the society relies on connection, emotional connection to the land. And it's also, when that's lost, there's a real displacement. And I think, and it's also works in the other way around. Like, when you do feel the connection, it's like, the penny drops, and for me, late teens, connecting music with, my culture, and just feeling good and right in who I was and what I was doing for the world. And, I think that was a big penny drop moment for me.
Well, the influences that we talked about in the beginning, Bill Withers, and was that from your mum? Was she a big Bill Withers fan?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, my uncles were big reggae and soul listeners. So yeah, I lots of the time I don't think, like, I always say that I didn't have a choice on what music style I ended up playing, because I was just drowned in all this stuff. And then now I can't write music without it having this Polynesian flavour. And I was just like, well, it's it's not me.
Yeah, and the rise of the ukulele. It's interesting because many years I had my own guitar shops and rode that wave of the acoustic guitar, the rise of the acoustic guitar. Well, it rose over a long period of time, but then I was away from it about 2010, and all of a sudden these shops kept appearing that were just selling ukuleles.
Amazing.
Yeah, and it's just become an amazing, accessible instrument, really, isn't it? Very accessible, which is why the Polynesian connection there, through the Hawaiians, the Tahitians, the Samoans, it's very strong, isn't it? So when did you first pick up the ukulele? Was it a younger age?
Yeah, it was young. Well, my mum played it, and we had a few around the house. So, yeah, it was, you know, it's interesting. Like, I get that question a lot of when you started playing, and I think, like, I actually can't quite remember because it was always there. There was always drums. There was always ukuleles, and I think the first time I actively really was like, okay, I'm going to play this was, you know, kind of, I guess around 10 or 11. But still, it was all for fun, and it was just conveniently there. And I think that's what I love about Polynesian culture, not just Samoan culture, is this integration of music in life and singing. You know, it's no big thing to just sing.
Yeah.
It's you know, it's no big thing also to cry or to be angry. It's, you know, this output of emotion is really, I think, is really healthy. And you know, yeah, this and I had that during growing up, you know, in Australia, and I just wasn't aware of it. It was just happening. And now, as I look back, and I'm like, oh yeah, I guess now that I'm a professional, that was my formal training. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, did you do music at school at all? Was it?
No, I didn't. Yeah.
No, isn't that amazing?
It just really just took over my life when I went there. I ended up doing music at uni, so
yes,
you know, but that was post when I was like actively set this target. I'm like, you know what, I'm going to go for this.
But that was after your first album, wasn't it? Had you?
Yeah, so my first album was my university assignment. So it was all happening around that same
And this
time.
is at Southport, and
yes,
the Griffith Uni there that had 24/7 access to a recording studio for students.
100%. Yeah, for students. It was a dream. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
living the dream there, totally. And I noticed
it really was.
I noticed that you've revisited that. Have you reimagined that album that you recorded 10 years ago?
Yeah, I have. You know,
and you released that? That's come out now?
Yeah, that's out now. Well, you know, you click your fingers and time goes quickly.
Yes.
And I just, you know, when COVID hit 2020, at home, I set up a home studio, and yeah, I just realised it had been 10 years since I'd released it, the very first album. So I just started looking at the songs again and thinking about that time and, about everything that happened since. And so, yeah, I just re-recorded them, and some versions are similar, some are a little bit different. I just thought it would be a nice little project to revisit these songs.
So you also toured with Xavier, right? And you performed drums in his band, is that right, there at some stage?
Yeah. I met Xavier at a coal seam gas rally in Lismore.
Yeah.
Just we had some mutual friends, and he suggested if we should have a jam, and we had a 20-minute jam, and then he said, "Oh, let's do a gig." And the first gig was actually Blues Fest. It drew 20,000 people, and I had no idea. And so I'm standing backstage about to go on stage. Now, we'd played for 20 minutes, but the set was 1 hour, so I was like, what is going to happen? And then we did the show. It went great, and then like a month later, I jumped on the tour bus with him around the US, and we're still very good friends, and we played together I toured with him as his primary drummer for 5 years.
That would have been an amazing experience.
Yeah, incredible experience.
And I saw, reading a little bit about Xavier, his own personal background of discovering or knowing that he was First Nations as well, and taking that out to the world and navigating. And, you know, we spoke about that a lot, you know, his connection, and that back to connection, and he found out that his grandmother was part of the stolen generation, and they still don't know exactly where she came from, but it's been a long journey to try and sort of hash all that up, and you know, and for him connecting with that culture and being an activist for you know,
Indigenous rights in Australia and the world has been, a real identity and a beautiful thing for him in his life.
Yes, I noticed that they'd, up in Arnhem Land, they gave him, where they bring him into the tribe and initiate him, they give him tribal recognition, because it's always difficult. I could imagine being First Nations, having your grandmother stolen, you're not really clear on who your traditional people are. And then a lot of people will attack that because they'll say, they're just using that as leverage, But there are so many Australians who realise, and I've met so many who say to me, I know that I've got First Nations connections, in my lineage, but I'm not even going to mention it, they think, because here I am at 30, or 40, and I don't want to come out and say it because people just think I'm wanting to tick a box, but I say, no, don't be ashamed. Go for it. Like, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
There are so many. I think that's why I remember in one year, about maybe it was 15, 20 years ago, they used to say there are 300,000 First Nations people in Australia. And now, because people are actually not afraid, after that story got told about bringing them home, the whole UN investigation report into the stolen generation, more and more people came forward. And now I think we're up to 800,000.
Wow, beautiful.
Some large number. I mean, it's still 3%, but I think the number was very small for a number of years. And there is so much beautiful authorship, through many writings now about those journeys and the healing of those journeys. The families realising what's been done to them, and also, I suppose, there's more coming together, hopefully even more than there has been into the future,
Yeah, I feel like there is an undercurrent, there is movement. It's slow, but there is movement. And, I just hope that that it continues, and that there's this, what I'd love to see is just there's the pride. I feel like that's a big step in imagine a country where everyone's proud of the Indigenous culture. It'd be such a different feeling, such a different shift. The way that, because I'm proud of it. I'm proud that I live in Australia, and there's the oldest living culture to ever exist is here. It's incredible, and the it should be in primary schools. All our education should be Indigenous stories, and there's so much there, and it's happening. It's just super slow, but we'll get there.
Super slow, and it's in small chunks. Uncle Alan Parsons, I've interviewed him twice on the podcast, and he goes out to 4-year-olds in kindergartens and tells the story, the dreaming, the rainbow serpent. He introduces them to the ancient stories, which he gets excited when a 4-year-old goes home and tells their dad that they had this First Nations man come and talk, and he talked about the power of the yarning circle. So Dad was a landscaper and turned up at the kindergarten and bought these big sandstone blocks and created a yarning circle for the kids to have. How powerful is that?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Beautiful, And you're right, it's got to start.
That.
It's got to start at such a young age, this sharing. And as you say, time goes so quickly. Within 20 years, you've got babies in primary school, and by 2040, you've got this educated group of young people who are in their 20s understanding the stories and helping support First Nations to find, themselves and not be feel like they're disconnected, to their country. And a lot aren't. I mean, a lot are connected to country. I've found a lot now exploring more and being more open about where they've come from. but there's still so many disengaged, through the trauma over generations, But,
Baby
you're
steps.
right. Baby steps.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of Indigenous timelines too, I mean, we say slowly. And so if, we look at 67 as a major sort of point in terms of Australian, it's not that long ago, 1967, when they were not flora and fauna, that they actually could vote. It's not that long ago. So, even the sorry movement, yes, it's 2008, but, we've got still a lot more healing and stories to share to get and educate people. Hence, even having you here on the show talking about growing up as a Australian with a Samoan heritage, and even probably becoming a Samoan man who is Australian and walking in those three worlds, the Gold Coastian or the the Samoan and the Australian.
Yeah. Yeah, well, look, it's an easy, I feel that the easy way out is to complain or to throw it away, to look at something like it's their fault or it's their problem. It's like, it's just there's a choice. You can make a choice. You can sort of look at it negatively, or you can just try and embrace it. And we get that choice every day with every little task that we do. And that's the business that I feel like I'm in, is trying to encourage myself and everyone to look at themselves, look at ourselves, and how that we can improve our lives and the people around us,
So have you thought and talked much about, those key issues that are sort of, I suppose, part of this healing that First Nations and, the broader community are aware of? I mean, I know even us just having this discussion, we're not going to solve anything, but making people aware of the Uluru Statement of the Heart, in 2015, as that progresses, around a treaty or around constitutional recognition, or, what, I know this is just an opinion sort of seeking, not saying that you have all the answers either, but what would you think, looking at and talking about this stuff, what is a way forward? Is the Uluru Statement of the Heart about sovereignty, accepting that this land was never ceded by the First Nations people, that was stolen, if you look at it historically, what do you feel is a better way forward, the treaty or a constitutional recognition, which only really writes them as a footnote into the sort of English or the British experiment? What's your thought? Is a treaty like Yothu Yindi sung about still a way to go? Or do you have a
good question. Yeah, I think it is. I feel like there's lots of parts to this puzzle and picture, though, and I do feel like that is a step that many Indigenous people require and need. And I think, like, going back to my story and drawing from what I've grown up learning and listening, the thing that I love about Samoan culture is there's so many fundamentals about being present, compassionate, and listening. There's lots of meetings in Samoa, I'm sure. Get your, and I guess that for me, I always try and get to these real simple fundamentals, and a lot of it is compassion and listening. And I feel like how many times when you're in the middle of a conversation, you're thinking about what you're going to say and you're not even listening to the person you're talking to. And, you know, I feel like that listening game hasn't, you know, we're not so good at it when we're trying to, there's all these people making up, you know, ways to help the Indigenous, but it's like we got to listen to what they believe and what they think and what they need. And if a treaty's a part of that, then sure, you know, I'm all for it. But I'm all for conversations like this, and because I know nothing, too, you know, so that's the way I get educated is to have conversations like this and conversations with Indigenous people and just to keep moving through it slowly.
Yeah, because it is complex with so many different views and so many different experiences, and carrying the generational trauma too. And the other contentious one, and we've dealt with this on this podcast several times, you know, again, not to solve it, but to make people, the listeners, go away and do their own thinking and talking and listening. Change the date, you know, Australia Day, Evasion Day, Survival Day. I mean, I've read lots and lots about this topic to try to get my head around it. And I know that I'm not going to affect the outcome, but you realise it's so complex. Even by changing the date, any other date you pick has equally as much trauma around those dates. You know, some people are pretty clear about what another date should be and what its meaning is. And it's so complex because of the emotion of, you know, this particular line in the sand that people think change. But I read a beautiful book about the 300 years prior to colonisation and what could have occurred. There were so many sliding door moments. We could have been French. We could have been Portuguese. We could have been Dutch. We were Dutch, you know, the Dutch were trading here. Although the First Nations people weren't necessarily interested in trading except with the moccasins, you know, up in the Indonesian islands. But it's fascinating that changing the date is not the ultimate answer, but it could be too. I mean, I'm not trying to even say that I know, but Stan Grant summed it up beautifully and said, by changing the date really doesn't change anything. We've got to really connect these stories, and probably that day should be, both stories should be shared in that same moment, which is how you bring cognitive dissonance together, holding two different belief ideas and merging them and fusing them. You know, there lies the potential answer, maybe. But I'm not saying, if they moved it, I'd be happy. If the broader First Nations people were more comfortable with a different date, I will absolutely support it. It's a real, you know, like you say, it's just such a big loaded topic, and how do we unload it in a way, you know? Yeah, because it's sort of complex. Like we're in this present moment and we're looking to the past and we're looking to the future, and it's so in those three worlds, what's more important here? Is the future more important than the past? You know, and I would say yes. Like I believe in acknowledgement, but also believe in, you know, making a better future by doing stuff now. I agree, and that's the separate silos can be quite. You end up with a divisive mechanism. In other words, it's always been known historically that power loves to divide. And in this debate of whether it's Invasion Day or whether it's Australia Day, creates a divide. And therefore, the power, you know, the energy of power seeks to love that, loves the fact that there's this divisive mechanism. And through coming together and healing and unification, you can sort of stop that divide, you know. So that's probably the bigger picture. It's hard because people want to fly the Australian flag, and, you know, First Nations people and all the allies and supporters want to fly the Aboriginal flag, which even that there for a while was quite a contentious issue, you know, when someone trademarked it and, through the intellectual property. Thankfully, at least I suppose that's relieved some of that tension. But we need to relieve some more tension, or have at least some really serious listening sessions with First Nations people and try to resolve it, because it really feels like it will never resolve. But I know it will at some point, But we don't want it to. We don't want it resolved with atrocities or any violence. We want it to be resolved in a really passive, non-violent way,
Yeah, and I guess circling back to what we've spoken a bit about, it is about, it's going back to that connection issue. It's like we're all basically trying to connect the person that wants to wave that Australian flag is because they want to be proud of the Australian culture that represents them, and likewise for the people that don't want to hang that, don't want to raise that flag. So it's I completely hear what you're saying, and it is a journey to share that connection, and imagine everyone being connected to Indigenous culture, have their connection and be proud of it. It would be special, and I think lots of people don't know how. I don't know how, and that's a big journey for everyone, is to find their place in connecting with this beautiful culture.
Exactly. I agree 100%. And it's exploring it and talking to as many different First Nations views, and being respectful that all of those views have come about through their own living journey. We haven't lived it, they've lived it through generations. But I think summing up, and we should let you go and go to surf and enjoy your day with your family. I just want to thank you so much for our conversations today. It's been very insightful as you navigate your own culture and navigate COVID, like all of us, coming out post-COVID very soon, hopefully in days. Whatever that means. I'm just wishful thinking.
Yeah. But, thanks for having me. I really, really appreciate it. And thanks for doing what you do. It's a beautiful podcast.
Thank you, Bo. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. And thanks, everyone. And don't forget to see us, our website, www.walking3worlds.com. Catch us on Spotify, Apple, Google, Amazon, every platform that you can imagine. I think we're on there. And, of course, at YouTube, our YouTube channel. Keep watching. Support us if you want to help in any little way that I can pay my editing team through Patreon, patreon.com. Just go to our website. You'll see the Patreon button. Any help, $3 a month, $6 a month, $10 a month. We'll even give you bonuses for all of those. We'd love any contributors. And I also pay my respects to all those contributors that are helping us. There's only a small handful, but I love you all. Thanks, Bobby. Have a great day. All right?
You too. Thanks so much.